My name is Ellis Barlow, and I was 31 years old when I found out that my family had spent my entire adult life measuring my usefulness against my worth, and finding the math worked out better for them if they never told me the difference. I was sitting at the long farm table in my parents' kitchen on a Sunday in November, the one with the scratches my brother and I put there in high school, watching my mother fold napkins into triangles, and my father scroll through something on his phone about the Caldwell wedding. My sister Amelia was getting married in June to a man whose father owned 3 car dealerships in the state. My parents had been planning this wedding since before the engagement was official, and I had been planning it too, quietly and visibly, in the margins of my own calendar. Visual, kitchen table, folded napkins, phone screen glowing, and the house smelled like the same apple candle my mother had burned since I was 14. My father glanced up at me and said, "Ellis, you always understand these things." It was not a question, and it was not a compliment. It was a sentence he used to clear space for whatever request was coming next. "Your sister's venue deposit is due, and we're a little short until your father's bonus comes in." I had heard that line 40 times. The bonus that always came, but never arrived in time. I reached for my bag and pulled out my checkbook. The number on the counter was $7,400. I wrote it without asking what happened to the $3,000 I'd put toward the catering deposit the month before, or the $1,500 toward the photographer the month before that. I remembered the first time I understood the difference between useful and valuable. I was 10 years old and Amelia was 7. No, not big deal. My mother had made a chart on the refrigerator with stars for chores, and I had 47 stars to Amelia's 12. My father came home from work and looked at the chart and said, "Ellis, you're so helpful." And then he picked up Amelia and spun her around and said, "And you're our sunshine." I didn't mind at the time. Helpful was a word that meant something. It meant I got to stay up later. It meant I could have seconds at dinner. It meant my parents noticed me in a way that had a shape to it. But I remembered the number from that year too. 47 stars. Why? And I remembered my mother pulling me aside in the laundry room and saying, "Your sister is delicate. You understand things. You always understand." She was teaching me how to fold my father's shirts the way he liked them, the sleeves tucked under in a particular crease. And I understood that the lesson was not about the shirt. The lesson was about the shape of my place. I was the one who folded. Now look, Amelia was the one who got held. Visual, refrigerator dot. Thicker, tardion. Najan tribes also cartisty. Wrinkled stars. Anin, Yashan and don't. Hi you, hello too. The second incident came when I was 19. I had just finished my sophomore year of college with a double major in business and economics, a 3.8 GPA, and an internship offer from a commercial real estate firm that paid $15 an hour. My parents took me to dinner, and my father said, "Ellis, you're going to do great things. You've always been the one with the head for numbers." It was the nicest thing he'd said to me in months. Then Amelia got into a slightly less competitive university 2 states away, and my mother spent the whole dinner asking if I could drive down to visit her on weekends. "You understand how hard it is for her," she said. "You always understand." Now, I drove down every other weekend that year, 540 miles round trip. No, I kept a log in my glove compartment because I was a 19-year-old who kept logs, and the total mileage for the academic year was 5,940 miles. I missed a final presentation in my economic modeling seminar because Amelia had a stomach flu, and my mother called and said, "You always understand, Ellis. You're so good in a crisis." I got a B in that class instead of the AA I needed for the internship. The firm hired someone else. I didn't tell anyone that the lost internship was worth $17,000 in wages over the summer. I didn't tell anyone that the B+ meant I didn't qualify for the scholarship renewal, and I had to take out an extra $6,000 in student loans. I just told them it was fine. I always told them it was fine. I was 31 years old, and I had been telling them it was fine for 21 years. The arrangement started the year I turned 26. I had been working for 3 years as a commercial leasing agent in a mid-sized firm downtown, doing the kind of work nobody notices until something goes wrong. Lease administration, compliance tracking, renewal notifications. The invisible arithmetic that keeps commercial real estate from collapsing into a pile of lawsuits. I made $58,000 a year, and I lived in a one-bedroom apartment with a parking spot that leaked oil onto my tires. My parents had just signed a personal guarantee on a small retail property they wanted to flip, a former hardware store on a declining Main Street, and the bank had asked for a second guarantor because their credit was good but not great. Visual, office cubicle, filing cabinet, thick lease binder. My father called me at work. "Ellis, you always understand these things. We just need your name on the line. It's a formality. The property's going to pay for itself in 18 months. I signed the guarantee. I was 26 years old, and I was useful. I didn't know then that the guarantee had a mechanism buried in its fine print. Section 14, subsection C, page 47 of the loan agreement. A clause about changes in primary use. My father had never read it. The bank officer had barely mentioned it. No. But I had read it because I was the one who read things, and I knew, even then, that there was a lever in that language. I just didn't know I would need to use it. The property didn't pay for itself in 18 months. It took 34 months, and I was the one who found the tenant who finally leased it. I was the one who negotiated the terms. I was the one who handled the compliance filings when the tenant's business license hit a snag. My parents sent me a nice email thanking me for my help. They didn't ask about the guarantee. They didn't mention that my name was still on the loan. Hey, I was useful, and I always understood. 3 years later, the Caldwell wedding arrived. Amelia and her fiancé had picked a venue that cost $42,000 for the Saturday booking alone. A converted textile mill with exposed brick and a mezzanine level, and a catering kitchen that required a separate bond because of the gas lines. My mother called me in March and said, "Ellis, we need you to handle the vendor coordination. You're so organized. You always understand this stuff." I said yes. I always said yes. I started a spreadsheet and a file folder and a separate email account just for wedding logistics. I tracked the florist's delivery schedule and the lighting rental and the cake delivery window. I negotiated a 15% discount on the linens by switching to a less popular rental company. I called the venue's events director 11 times to confirm the setup timeline. I was, by any measure, the person running the wedding. Nobody said thank you. Nobody said anything. This was what I did. I was the one who understood. I also paid for things. Small things at first. And And what would you think was the extra security guard because the venue required one and the family budget didn't have room. $100? Any you. The upgraded chairs because Amelia had mentioned she hated the standard ones. 1,400. The champagne toast upgrade because my mother said it would impress the Caldwells. 900. I kept the receipts in a folder in my desk drawer. I didn't know why I kept them. I just knew that I always kept things. The first time I heard the phrase again was at Easter dinner. The whole family was assembled in my parents' dining room, and Amelia was showing the Caldwells, her future mother-in-law, a woman with very good jewelry and very polite eyes, the seating chart for the reception. I had designed that seating chart. I had spent 6 hours reconciling the A-list and the B-list and the only, if they send a gift list. My mother looked at the chart and said, Ellis did the fine work on the arrangements. She always understands these logistical puzzles. The Caldwell woman smiled at me like I was a very clever party planner. I smiled back. I was the one who understood. Visual. Dining room, seating chart on table, glass of wine. The second time was at a bridal boutique in June. Now, Amelia was trying on dresses, and my mother was crying, and my father was paying for the alterations on a credit card I had consigned in 2019, so he could consolidate some debt. The card had a $10,000 limit, and at that moment it was carrying a balance of $8,200. My father had been paying the minimum for 3 years. The dress alterations were $412, which he charged to the same card, and I watched the transaction go through on my phone because I had the app for that account. He didn't know I monitored it. He didn't know I could see every charge. He didn't know I'd been paying the overlimit fees for the past 6 months because he kept forgetting. $407 in fees. I had paid them without saying anything. You always understand, Ellis, my mother said at the boutique, because I had agreed to drive the wedding dress home in my car so it wouldn't get wrinkled in theirs. The trunk was too small for the garment bag. The dress had to ride in the back seat. I sat in the front seat with my knees pressed against the dashboard because the garment bag took up the legroom. I drove 40 minutes home like that. I was 31 years old, and I was still folding myself into smaller shapes. The third time was at the rehearsal dinner. The Caldwells had rented a private room at a steakhouse, and there were 40 people in white tablecloths and a wine list that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. I was standing near the bar with my phone in my hand, trying to confirm that the floral delivery for the next morning was still on time, when my father walked over and clapped me on the shoulder. Ellis, you always understand these things, he said. We're going to need you to handle the photographer in the morning. He's asking about final payment. Just square it with your card and we'll reimburse you next week. The photographer's final payment was $3,800. I nodded. I always nodded. I made the payment on my phone while the Caldwells watched my sister open gifts at the head table, and everyone clapped. But I had already started pulling the string. 3 months earlier, after the boutique, after the credit card fees, after I had paid for the security guard and the chairs and the champagne and a dozen other line items that had never been mentioned again, I had gone back to the commercial property guarantee. I had pulled the file from my home office, a manila folder with the bank's letterhead and my signature on 7 different pages. I had done I don't want any section on here or zone 3. Subsection C. One more time. And I had made a quiet decision. The clause was about primary use. If the property changed from retail to any other classification, the guarantee was subject to review. The review required a new underwriting. The new underwriting required a credit check on every guarantor. The tenant in the property was a small clothing boutique now, but the zoning had been reclassified 18 months earlier to allow for mixed-use residential. The bank knew about the reclassification, but nobody had filed the paperwork to update the guarantee. I had signed a guarantee for retail. The property was no longer retail. The mechanism was alive and waiting. It had been waiting for 4 years, and I was the only person who knew. Visual, manila folder, loan agreement, highlighted clause. The week before the wedding, I made the call. I sat in my apartment with the lease agreement spread across my coffee table and my laptop open to the bank's website, and I dialed the number for the loan servicing department. I spoke to a woman named Jessica, who sounded tired and efficient. I told her that I was a guarantor on a commercial loan, and I believed there might be a discrepancy in the property classification. She pulled the file and I heard her keyboard clicking for a full minute. Then she said, "You're right. The property shows as mixed-use residential. The guarantee is flagged for retail." I asked what that meant. She said it meant the bank would need to reassess the guarantee. It meant the guarantee was, in the interim, unsupported. It meant that the loan was currently in a non-compliant state, and that until the paperwork was corrected, the bank would likely freeze any draws against the line of credit. I asked if the guarantors would be notified. No. She said yes. A letter would be sent to the primary address on file. I asked if there was a time frame. She said 10 to 14 business days. The wedding was in 12 days. The day of the wedding arrived. I woke up at 5 in the morning because I had to pick up the floral arrangements from the wholesaler. I had agreed to do this because I always understood these things. The wholesaler was across town, and the flowers were in buckets, and I had to transport them in the trunk of my car, which meant I had to change clothes twice, so I wouldn't get pollen on the dress I was wearing for the ceremony. I drove back to the venue at 7 and set the flowers in the staging area and confirmed the delivery schedule with the caterer. I was calm. I was always calm, but I was also aware, with a clarity that felt almost clinical, that I was the only person in that building who had read the entire contract. Visual, flower buckets, car trunk, venue, entrance, Amelia, Amelia, off Cartagen. The Caldwells arrived at 10 in a black SUV. The father, Richard Caldwell, was a man who wore suits that looked expensive even in summer and carried himself like someone accustomed to being the richest person in any room. His wife, Patricia, was the woman who had smiled at me like a clever party planner. Their son, the groom, was named James, and he was fine. He was a fine man with fine manners, and he made my sister happy in a way that seemed genuine. I had nothing against James Caldwell. I had everything against the machine that had been built around him. My family arrived at 11. My mother was in a cream-colored dress, and my father was in a suit he had bought for this wedding. The one I'd helped him pay for because the tailor had required a deposit, and he'd been a little short. Amelia arrived last in a white car with the dress in the back seat, and my mother cried, and my father patted my shoulder and said, "Ellis, you always understand these things. Can you help your sister with her train when she's ready?" I nodded. "You are not practicing." I helped Amelia with her train. I pinned it into the bustle and I made sure the lace wasn't dragging, and I touched her elbow and told her she looked beautiful because she did. She was beautiful. She was the sun. I was the one who understood. And the ceremony was at 2 in the afternoon. I stood on the side of the altar because I was not in the wedding party. I was the sister who was useful. Amelia had chosen her best friend from college as the maid of honor, and a cousin from the Caldwell side as the other attendant. I was not offended. I did not feel offense anymore. I felt something colder and more precise. The vows were exchanged. The rings were presented. I'm not Betrayal. The photographer I'd paid for took pictures I would not appear in. The musicians I had coordinated played music I had selected because nobody else had time. The reception began at 5, and the guests moved to the mezzanine, and the champagne was poured, and the toast was made, and I stood near the bar with my phone in my hand, waiting. The letter from the bank had arrived the day before. I had forwarded it to my personal email. I had printed a copy and folded it into thirds and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket. It was a single page. It explained in clean bureaucratic language that the guarantee was being reviewed and that the line of credit was frozen pending resolution. It was not accusatory. It was not emotional. It was just a letter. I had held it in my hands while I was getting dressed, and I had felt nothing except a quiet sense of completion. The machine had moved. The machine had moved. The lever had fired. The architecture of the thing was now visible to anyone who looked. At 7 o'clock, my father pulled me aside. The Caldwells were at the table with Amelia and the rest of the family. The music was playing, and the photographer was taking candids, and the night was going exactly as planned. My father leaned in and said, "Ellis, you always understand these things. We've got a small issue with the bar tab. The venue is saying the card declined. Can you square it with yours, and we'll reimburse you next week." The bar tab was $9,200. I looked at him. His tie was slightly crooked. No, his face was flushed with wine, and with the comfort of having me around. He had never once in 21 years thought about what it cost me to be the person who always understood. He had never calculated the hours or the miles or the dollars or the folded edges of my own life. He had looked at me and seen a useful thing. He had never once asked if I had anything else inside me. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the letter. I unfolded it. I held it up so he could see the bank's logo and the paragraph about the guarantee and the line about the freeze on the credit line. "They sent this yesterday," I said. "The commercial property was rezoned. The guarantee is non-compliant. The line of credit is frozen until it's resolved." He stared at the letter. "What are you talking about? That's your name on that guarantee. You're the guarantor." "I am," I said. "And I'm telling you the bank has reviewed the terms and they've paused the line of credit. I don't know if your credit card is connected to that line or if it's just the property account. But the card is frozen because the guarantee is frozen." I told him this in a measured voice. I was not angry. I was not sad. I was simply reporting a fact. I was useful in the way I had always been useful. I had read the contract. I had understood the mechanism, and I had let it fire. I had not stopped it. I had simply not stopped it. My father's face changed. It went through several expressions in the span of a single breath. First confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like recognition. He opened his mouth to speak, and then Richard Caldwell walked over. The groom's father, the wealthiest man in the room. He had a glass of scotch in his hand and an expression of mild curiosity. Visual, bank letter, hand-holding paper. Caldwell approaching. Is there a problem? Richard Caldwell asked. No. His voice was polite. He was not a cruel man. He was just a man who had never been in a room where he wasn't the center of gravity. My father said no, just a small bank issue. Ellis always understands these things. She's handling it. Richard Caldwell looked at the letter in my hand. What? He looked at my face. Then he looked at my father and said, "Is that the guarantee on the retail property on Main Street?" The Caldwell Group actually looked at that property a few years ago. We passed on it because the zoning was already transitioning. I assumed the guarantee had been restructured. I spoke before my father could. It wasn't, I said. It was never restructured. The bank just froze the line of credit. It's a compliance issue. Richard Caldwell blinked. He looked at my father. He looked at me. He understood in that moment that the credit line for the family's primary account was tied to a guarantee on a property he had correctly identified as a bad investment 3 years earlier. He understood that my father had not managed the paperwork. He understood that I, the quiet sister, the party planner, the one who understood things, was the signature holding the entire structure upright. Your daughter's name is on that guarantee? Richard Caldwell asked my father. Then, he said it like a question, but it was not a question. My father nodded. Oh, she's been helping with the property for years. Helping, Richard Caldwell repeated. Nah, that's an interesting word for someone whose credit is tied to a non-compliant commercial loan. He looked at me. How long have you been a guarantor on that property? 9 years, I said. I signed when I was 26. I've been paying the insurance premiums and the property tax adjustments out of my own accounts for the last 4 years. I haven't been reimbursed. I said it plainly. I did not mention the $73,000 I had tracked in my spreadsheet, the total amount of my personal funds that had gone into the property and into the wedding and into the credit card and into the other dozens of invisible transfers over the years. I did not mention the scholarship I had lost or the internship I had missed or the miles I had driven or the hours I had spent making myself smaller. I just said the words, and Richard Caldwell heard them, and my father heard them, and the small bubble of the party began to collapse inward. My mother arrived. She had heard something from across the room. She saw the letter in my hand and the expression on my father's face, and she said, "Ellis, what did you do?" She said the phrase then, the phrase, the one that had been used on me my whole life. You always understand these things. I don't know why you would make a scene today of all days. She meant it as a dismissal. She meant it as a way to fold me back into the shape she expected. I held up the letter and said, I didn't make the scene. The bank did. I told you I was on the guarantee. I told you I had read the contract. Nobody else did. Visual, mother's face, letter held up, party backdrop. Richard Caldwell stepped back. He looked at my mother, and then at my father, and then at me. "Mrs. Barlow," he said, "I think you need to understand that your daughter's name has been on a loan that your husband hasn't properly managed. That's not her making a scene. That's her telling you the truth." The exterior witness was not on my side because I had asked him to be. He was on my side because he knew the cost of bad guarantees. He knew the architecture of these things. He knew what it meant when a guarantor was treated like a secretary. He said it out loud. He said it in front of the whole table. And I watched my family's faces shift into the shape of people who had just discovered that they had been holding something upside down for a very long time. I did not scream. I did not cry. I walked over to the bar and I paid the bar tab with my personal credit card because I did not want the caterer to lose money on my account. I was not cruel. I was never cruel, but I was no longer useful in the way they needed. I left the wedding at 8:47. I walked out through the parking lot, and I got into my car and I drove home. I did not look back. I did not need to. The silence started the next morning. My phone rang at 7. I know. I let it ring. It was my mother. It rang again at 8. My father. It rang again at 9. A voicemail. Then another. Then a text. I did not read any of them. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window, and I watched the silence settle around me like something I had been waiting for my whole life. I waited 3 days before I responded to anything. I called my sister on the 4th day. She answered on the first ring. No, she was crying. She told me the Caldwells had asked questions, difficult questions, questions about my parents' financial management. She told me Richard Caldwell had said something to her privately, something about how a family that treats one daughter like a resource while parading another like a prize is not a family he wants his son to marry into. She told me she had defended me. She told me she had never known about the guarantee, or the money, or the years of folded edges. "I didn't know," she said. "I didn't know you were paying for everything." I told her I knew she didn't know. I told her I had never expected her to know. I told her that was the point. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I'm sorry." It was not a full apology. It was a flicker. It was a crack in the facade of the sun. I took it for what it was. I told her I would be okay. I told her I had been okay for a long time. I just hadn't been seen. My mother called 6 times over the next week. I showed on the 7th. She was frantic, breathless, trying to piece together the shape of the disaster. The bank had officially frozen the line of credit. The credit card was suspended. The property guarantee was under review, and the bank had mentioned the possibility of calling the loan if the primary use didn't get corrected in 60 days. My mother did not understand any of it. She was not good with numbers. She had never been good with numbers. She had been good at looking at me and seeing something that could be used. "Ellis," she said, "you always understood these things. Can't you just fix it? Can't you just talk to the bank and fix it?" I said, "I'm not fixing it, Mom." She was silent. You was silent. I think she had never heard me say no. How? I think she had never heard me say anything except yes. I think she was trying to reconcile the daughter who folded shirts with the daughter who had a lawyer on speed dial and a spreadsheet of every dollar she had ever lent. I hung up the phone. I turned off the ringer. I opened my laptop, and I looked at the account balances, and the property filings, and the lease agreements, and I saw, for the first time, a clean ledger. Visual. Laptop screen. Spreadsheet columns. Bank balances. The bank did not call the loan. The property was restructured with a new guarantee. My father's a loan with a larger deposit and a higher interest rate. The line of credit was unfrozen. The wedding was paid for finally by the Caldwells, because Richard Caldwell was not a man who allowed debts to float. But the terms had changed. The architecture had been exposed. My mother stopped calling after the second week. My father sent a single email, all capitals, full of a rage he had never shown me, because he had never needed to show me anything. I deleted it without reading it again. I kept the receipts. I kept the manila folder. I kept the I kept the memory of Richard Caldwell's face when he realized that the quiet sister was the one running the show. But I did not keep the guilt. I let that go. A month later, I bought a table, a small oak table, 6 feet long with 4 matching chairs. I put it in my dining room, which had been empty before, and I set it with the place settings my mother had given me for a wedding I did not have. I sat at that table alone on a Sunday morning, and I looked at the empty chairs and I felt no sadness. I felt the shape of my life, built by my own hand, measured by my own ledger. My name is Ellis Barlow. I am 31 years old. And I no longer understand anything I do not choose to understand.